As you may know, every single summer we commemorate a 3-week period which goes all the way back to about 2,000 years ago when our enemies, the Romans, finally breached the wall of Jerusalem. And it took them 3 weeks from breaching the wall to actually getting to the temple on the Temple Mount and tragically burning it down. So during these 3 weeks, we commemorate this tragic period. We begin the 3 weeks with a fast day on the 17th of Tammuz. We conclude the 3 weeks with a fast day on the 9th day of Av, the destruction of the temple. And there are always 3 Shabbosos that we have during the 3 weeks. And the very first Shabbos of these 3, during these 3 weeks, every single year, we read from the prophet Jeremiah, which we just read this year in the year 2024, 5784. We read it last Shabbos. It is associated, though, with the Torah portion, which we're going to be reading this Shabbos, which is Matos and Maseh. We read a double portion. And it is a prophet of Jeremiah where God says to Jeremiah, he says, Ma ataroya, what do you see? What is the prophetic vision that you are seeing? And the prophet Jeremiah responds and says, Makel shaked aniraya. I am seeing a makel, a stick, a shaked, which is bearing almonds. It's giving off almonds. It was an almond tree that he saw. And God responds to what Jeremiah shared that he saw and said, Hey, taftaliros, you are seeing well, you are seeing good. And why? Because I am going to be shoked. The same word which means an almond, a makel shoked, God says, shoked, I will speedily do that which you are seeing. Tragically, in that event, God was telling Jeremiah that something tragic is going to befall the Jewish people because they were not following in the ways of God, which in fact happened, because Jeremiah was from the great Jewish true prophets, and what God told him tragically did happen. But there's a lot of significance to this and why we read it, and so much we can learn from it. The first thing is that we read about this prophecy that Jeremiah had of an almond tree simply because we are taught that almonds take 3 weeks from blossoming until ripening. Well, we know the association already because we are commemorating 3 weeks of tragedy. So there's a direct association between almonds and the 3 weeks. However, whenever we have an association which comes from the Torah, we know that association is far more than just a symbolic one, but it actually is deeply connected one with the other. And the deep connection is that almonds that we eat, which are sweet almonds, when they begin to develop at the outstage, at the earlier part of their development, they are actually bitter. And only later on do they become sweet. In fact, there are some almonds that work in the reverse, where they are sweet at their outset and become bitter. Those are known as luzim, but shkedim are almonds which are bitter and they become sweet. And this is actually the entire significance of the 3 weeks. This guides us in understanding what our focus is meant to be during the 3 weeks, which is to learn to transform bitterness to sweetness. Transforming bitterness to sweetness. And that's why we read about this prophecy regarding an almond tree. Because more than just the fact that there's a symbolism of 21 days of 3 weeks, there is the deep message of bitterness being turned into sweetness. And we know the enormous pleasure that one has from a sweetness that comes out of a bitterness. That sweetness gives a person far greater pleasure than something that just is sweet. It's sort of, in my mind, from my experience, the difference between drinking sweet wine and dry wine. Sweet wine is sweet. There is nothing like rich and deeply pleasurable to the sweetness of sweet wine. But dry wine, when you drink dry wine and you can sense the sweetness, and you can read this actually when you see the way they describe the different wines, the hints, they always use the word hints. It hints to certain flavors. And that's because it's not explicit and just there, but it's something that you have to sense. And when you can sense that, there's a certain great pleasure in catching the subtle sweetness within the dryness of the wine. And that is really the art of life, is to be able to have experiences which are sometimes difficult. But it's only through those difficult experiences that we can actually reach a richness of life and a sweetness that otherwise can't be had. The love in a marriage, the love a couple has after their first year of marriage cannot be compared even closely to the love a couple has after 40 years of marriage, 50 years of marriage, because it's so much deeper and richer, and it required an enormous process and a lot of back and forth between the spouses, but that brings out a special richness and deepness, and that is the entire reason why God puts us in a state of exile. Why does he put us in a state of exile? The entire purpose of the exile is not to oppress us. The entire purpose of the exile is to bring out the full richness of what he invested within us, to the point that we bring that into the world, so that the culmination of the exile is going to be the coming of Mashiach, which will be an experience for the entire universe, where the entire world is going to experience the true beauty and richness of a world integrated with the awareness of the divine presence. And this is also the reason why there's an odd language that Jeremiah uses, the prophet uses, in expressing this almond tree. He says, I see a makal shakeh. Now, a makal, it really means a stick. It doesn't mean a tree. A stick with almonds. A stick is an inanimate, something that a branch that has been detached from a tree, no longer has any life to it. It has become hard like a stick, no more flexible like a branch. That doesn't give birth to almonds. So why would he use the language of a makal, a stick, and not a branch or a tree, right? An eitz shaked, or whatever the proper terminology would be. But he uses the language makal. But here's for a very significant reason. We know that the Jewish people are referred to as a shevet or shvatim. We are made up of 12 tribes. And the tribes are called shvatim, tribes. But we are also called something else. We're also called matos, which is the name of this week's Torah portion. Matos, so there are 12 matos, 12 tribes. But the word mata doesn't only mean a tribe, it also means a stick. It means the same thing as a makal that Jeremiah uses, a stick. The difference between the two are that a shevet is a stick that has been possibly already detached from the tree, but it still has what we call in Hebrew the lachluchis. It still has the moisture from being attached to the tree. It's one of those pieces of wood which have not dried up yet and has not become stiff and dry that you can throw into a fire. It won't burn yet. It still has the dampness. It still has life to it, some level of life to it. And we use the terminology shevet or shvatim, the tribes. We refer to as a shevet or shvatim when we're talking about the Jewish people, when we still have, during our period of history when we had our temple, when we were able to experience in a much more palpable way the presence of the divine. And we still had the lachluchis, the moisture of the divine within us. But once the temple was destroyed and we no longer can see in a very clear, palpable way the presence of the divine, we went from a shevet to a mata. We turned into a stick which is dried up and no longer has that moisture in it. However, ironically, there is something that a stick has that a branch doesn't have. What does a stick have? A stick is hard, firm, inflexible. A mata, when it still has moisture, is somewhat flexible. You can bend it. And there is a great virtue to a mata in inflexibility, which is very relevant to what we need to know in regard to the 3 weeks and our time in exile. And that is that the reason why the Jewish people are both reprimanded and praised for being stiff-necked, right? Like a staff, like a stick, which is unbendable, is because there is a virtue to being stubborn. And that is when someone is stubborn for the right things, then they have an absolute commitment to what they are doing. And the message is that during our time in exile, the way to overcome the challenges that face us is to study the Torah and know what is right, to know what God wants from us, and then to become firm like a makal, as Jeremiah says, or like a shevet, as a mata, as the name of this week's Torah portion is, where we become firm in our commitment. Another word for this that Hasidic philosophy uses is the word toikef. Toikef means a strength and a firmness that one stands in, which is uncompromising, an absolute commitment. And when someone stands in absolute commitment to something, nothing stops them. That is the most powerful way a person can be. And the way to get through exile is for us to look at the challenges that we have, the situations which are difficult. They're tough. But we're tougher. And we stand with a toughness and a firmness in commitment to what it is that we know is to be true. And through that, this is actually the path for a person to go to transform bitterness to sweetness. Because there's a fact about life that we must never forget. And that fact about life is that a person needs to be able to commit themselves in a disciplined manner to certain things and stick to it. And then they see amazing results. But if a person never makes a commitment, a firm commitment to something, they will never produce those sweet results. The sweetness only comes after there is an element of bitterness, which is, in this context, is not really bitterness, but a challenge that we have to give to ourselves to remain committed to something. And out of that comes this enormous sweetness. This is the entire theme of the 3 weeks. And so we have to simply ask ourselves a very basic question. What is one thing I am not yet absolutely committed to that God has put me on this earth to do? And let me make that commitment, that firm, absolute commitment that no matter what, I am going to do this. And I do it over and over and over. And a richness of life comes out, a sweetness comes out that otherwise we would never experience. And when we do this collectively, we bring ourselves, our people, and the entire world to the ultimate sweetness that we are aspiring to, which is the coming of Mashiach.